going to talk about this $1 trillion forecast, and it's part of a 4-step webinar series that we're going to be running as well. So you kind of hear the call to action presentation this morning. And what we're going to do is try to set some context. When I set out to create this webinar series, is a way to communicate that there is a bigger opportunity than most executives would realize. And you'll see that when we set context, and where I'm going to show you a slide that some of you have seen before, but it to me is the call to action. We'll take a look at some of the root cause issues, and then we'll start examining that potential path forward as we look to try to tell this story in a way that is digestible at the senior executive level, that motivates them to open their eyes to the opportunities that lie ahead and to set the wheels in motion to move in that direction. So it's part of a series. Again, the call to action is the content we're going to go through today. The next one, which we'll have, I've got a follow-up slide on this at the end of my presentation. We'll cover the dates for the different sessions. We'll start to diagnose what are the core issues that are really causing the kind of delays in achieving any sustainable improvements in the supply chain performance. We'll then have a session talking about the design. What do we have to change, and how do we create an operating model that allows us to deal with a lot of the inevitable consequences that are in our markets, the volatility, the ambiguity that we deal with, and things of that nature. With that in hand, then we can talk about the tasks of deploying this. What does it mean to bring an organization through the type of changes that this represents? Because they're a bit profound, they're a bit counterintuitive to some, but they are absolutely a critical part of the process to getting to those kind of benefits that everybody should be able to see. I'm a big tech fan. My team gets really humored by how often I bring up SpaceX. I look at, I'm one of the more senior guys around here, so I look at what's been going on in the technology space over the last, say, 30 years, and it's just amazing the things that have been created. Digital manufacturing, robotic surgery. I saw a little vignette on that the other day where some robots were operating on a pig, and it was the first successful demonstration of that kind of an approach. I'm not signing up for any of that just yet. Electrical vehicles, Brad himself told me and was bragging about how he rode in his Tesla from Atlanta to Kiowa Island without driving the car. That whole journey, he was left to using the autonomous driving features of the Tesla to get there. SpaceX, what an example, the things that they're doing. There's another Starship launch tomorrow. They figured out how to land the rocket on the tail, and now they've done it so many times, it's just become almost too commonplace. And obviously now AI with learning language models, agentic AI, the opportunities are profound. And it's just amazing to look at how much advancement has happened in technology during these periods. I mean, simple things like the iPhone are dramatic improvements, but nothing like what we've seen in these examples that I've shared here. But then if you look at this chart, it's like, what in the hell is going on here, right? This is a view of data from the US Federal Reserve of manufacturers' inventory turnover rates over the last 30 years. You want to be lower on this slide than higher, but you can see here things were starting to look like they were improving. I think it was driven a lot by the heat in the economy that led up to the Great Recession, which is right there in the middle of the chart, which saw a big negative turn in the wrong direction. You can see the onset of the pandemic there in 2020. And here we are 30 years later, and we're actually turning inventory at a slower rate. This is kind of mind-boggling when you think about how much money has been spent by companies on software trying to get to a better place. I watched a large automotive or a tire manufacturer embrace SAP during the same horizon. Project went years longer than expected. Business users thought they were going to get better results, and lo and behold, the needle didn't move. And so there's got to be some core issues. There's $1 trillion of inventory in US manufacturing. So think about this. What if we could just shave off 10% of that? That would free up in aggregate $100 billion of working capital that could do something more important for us than just collecting dust. So that's really what this call to action is about, is trying to open our eyes to the opportunities that are out there and to look for ways that we might be able to do something a little more SpaceX-like in how we approach achieving supply chain performance. I always cite out material requirements planning, or MRP. It is the foundational logic that is at the core of every supply chain solution virtually in the market. It was codified back in the 70s. And at the time, my old employer, IBM, was interested in trying to expand the use of computers outside of accounting applications. And a guy named Joe Orlicke came up with this method called MRP. The idea was pretty basic and pretty simple when you really think about it. Because customers don't want to wait when they give you an order, you have to start planning ahead because there's things you need to buy, whether it's raw materials or components or parts. You need to do some manufacturing or assembly. You may need to distribute that item out to the market to be able to meet that customer's demand. And the reality is that those chain of events have to take place in some way, shape, or form. And so MRP's logic was basically pretty straightforward. Feed in what you think the demand will be, your forecast. Maybe it's your order book. If you're an automotive supplier, you're getting a signal from the OEM as to what your requirements are. And you can then use MRP to backward schedule what you need to buy, manufacture, distribute to meet the demand, right? What are the core assumptions behind that logic? And there's a couple that are really, really problematic. First and foremost, the assumption is that the demand is known, that the forecast is accurate. And we all know that that's really not a valid assumption because, in fact, they vary. And that's what we'll talk about in the diagnostic webinar on August 5th. It also assumes that there's not going to be any variation. And we all know that that's not a truth that we can live with because suppliers are late. The port gets closed. The Strait of Hormuz gets blocked. I mean, there's things that happen all the time. Our manufacturing operations, we get shorthanded because there's a labor issue or the machines break down. I mean, there is sources of variation everywhere we look. And so that seems to have some flaws to it as well. And then the final one, which is the big one in a lot of ways, is that everybody's walking around assuming that this is the only way we can ensure that we've got materials available to meet whatever demand is coming in. So with that, let's take a look at, do these represent absolute truths? And if they don't, then they provide an opportunity for us to re-examine how we approach these, right? First principle thinking says boil every problem down to where there are no underlying assumptions because it will open your eyes to different possibilities. Once you get past the assumption that the rocket going to outer space is a one and done kind of situation, and you understand that the cost of the fuel to get that rocket to outer space is a tiny fraction of the total spend, you get really, really interested in figuring out how to preserve that booster rocket and how to land it on its tail. Because once you do that, the game changes dramatically. And that's what SpaceX is doing to space exploration. They're making reusability a real thing. Once you have those undisputable truths, you can look at it in a different way. And what would this mean for supply chain? Well, if we know that the truth is that we're forecasts, especially at the item level, will not be that accurate, then we need to think about ways to accept that. Maybe that's something we shouldn't try to get to the perfect forecast, because I dare anybody to think they're actually going to get there, because you're not. Or that they're going to be able to eliminate all the sources of variation. And instead, if we put our attention on, let's build a way of working, an operating model that allows us to deal with these inevitable consequences of inaccurate forecasts, inaccurate demand signals, or all the variation that we're facing, then we have an opportunity to do things in a different way. And you don't need to go too far to see that there are some actual examples like this. Taiichi Ohno, in his development of the Toyota production system, developed the concept of Kanban. And the idea here was very basic and simple. He wanted clear and visible signals on when to take action. And so as material was used, like on an automotive assembly line, they would be held in bins or whatever container was utilized. And when that bin was empty, because those parts had been applied to the vehicles going down the assembly plant, it signaled a resupply order. And that becomes what's known as a Kanban loop. Now, one of the other things that Ohno was after was make sure that when we do produce, there is an actual need for it. So if there are no bins empty that are at the production site of that part, there is no production. And so he also saw that this would be a way of preventing or minimizing the amount of overproduction that occurred. The beauty of Kanban is that it's pacing to the actual consumption, the real usage on the assembly line. If it's in a grocery store, it's the actual bottles that are being taken off the shelf of milk or whatever. You can pull to the actual demand and get away from that inaccurate forecast as the primary signal of what is driving replenishment. It makes a very clear and visible signal. And so the advent of demand-driven MRP was notable in that it allowed us to take these concepts of pull-based supply chain management and elevate them out of the Kanban loops because it could be done in software. And we did a webinar last year where we contrasted and compared the lean Kanban logic with the DDMRP elements, and they're basically very synonymous in terms of how they operate. And the great thing is that in the application, and you're going to hear some success stories today in the user conference, people have gotten results. And that was the whole mission of DD Tech, and that's the whole mission of Algo, is to ensure that clients get tangible and sustainable results. These are all adopters, and this is just a subset of the clients we've been working with over the years that have gotten really phenomenal benefits from this shift in the mindset away from forecast-driven planning to a more pull-based approach, which allows us to pace to the actual consumption in the market. And you'll hear some of those success stories today. Now, does this mean we don't need forecasting? And a lot of people in the early days of DDMRP were very critical that you're saying the forecasting isn't relevant. And the truth of the matter is, emphatically, no. We still need forecasting. Forecasting can be an essential ingredient in the overall development of a demand-driven operating model that allows us to pace our operations, how we run production, how we manage our materials to the actual true demand in the market, gaining the benefit of a more accurate signal. But we can use forecasting as a way to test that operating model. And that's part of the journey that we're going to go through over this webinar series to help people realize that there are opportunities to get to a better place while having some safeguards in place. What does this mean? Well, as an example, maybe it means that we start to find a way to make productive use of probabilistic forecasting. Probabilistic helps you understand the range of the different demand scenarios you may need to deal with. And it allows you to then utilize those in a scenario planning manner to test whether your stock buffer settings are correct, whether you have enough rough cut capacity to deal with the inevitable potential consequences that are coming down the path to you. So what we talk about then is shifting the role of forecasting to generating a way of seeing the future that is helpful to us in preparing that we are going to be prepared to deal with whatever consequences might come our way. The analogy I like to use here is, when I fly across the Atlantic to go see our customers in Europe, I sleep well because I know that the plane has been engineered and built to get there safely. That the reality is that the pilot is not operating the plane. They're not flying it all the way across the Atlantic, that the system is doing the job because it was built for the purpose. Yes, there may be events where we need to navigate around a storm, or there may be a traffic delay or things like that. There will be some human intervention along the way. But if we build a way of operating here that can allow us to deal with the inevitable consequences of variation, uncertainty in the forecast, that the client's demand may vary from what their original signals were, then we can put ourselves in a dramatically different spot where we can get very, very good service levels, which is the ultimate goal of any manufacturer distributor. We can do it with less inventory, and we can make it easier for our staff to do their job, because instead of fighting the system all the time, the system is actually helping them move forward in a way that they can make sense of and survive the day, if you will. So we change the paradigm. We look at focusing on how do we get those tangible improvements by utilizing stock buffers where they make sense, by tuning our production capacity in a way that aligns it to where the best and most critical demands are, that recognizes constraints, that helps us deal with the inevitable variation that is going to hit us regardless of all the things that we are going to run into. We'll talk about those designs in the third webinar in the series as a way of helping raise the awareness of how to actually approach the change. And then obviously, we need to talk about the change management issues. There will be people in the staff that will be nervous because they'll feel like their ways of working are going to be changed. There will be those that'll be excited about the change because they'll see the vision and they'll understand that. And obviously, as leaders, we need to shepherd the organization through those changes in a manner that allows us to get the benefits, get to a better place, and in essence, start to see that rocket landing on its tail. So with that, I'm going to kind of wrap up here and just remind you about this webinar series. This is the call to action. There is a huge opportunity, $1 trillion of inventory in US manufacturing. What if we could get 10, 15, 20% of that out of the mix, frees up a lot of working capital that might buy some extra machinery or capacity that would allow us to more flexibly deal with the variation that our demand patterns provide to us. We'll go through a diagnosis of what it means. And this applies to both engineer to order, make to stock environments. Whatever your demand signal is, whether you call it a forecast or the rolling schedule from an automotive OEM, or whatever your environment is, there are areas that you need to recognize, first of all, is what those patterns look like and how they ripple through your supply chain, and then get positioned to designing that kind of operating model, how you're going to manage your materials, how you're going to deal with scheduling, how you're going to use your production resources in a way that gives you the flexibility to deal with whatever comes your way. And then finally, we'll talk through the deployment steps that are needed, some of the considerations that will be part of all of that. There'll be white papers that accompany all of this. We also have in mind the idea of half-day kind of strategic session that for senior executives that would kind of encapsulate all of the content that we're putting together here in a way that would help them understand some of the opportunities that are available to them that maybe have kind of been, lost in the shuffle or acquiesced to this is as good as it's going to get. Inspired by what SpaceX is doing, what all of these things are doing, what Brad's doing when he takes his Tesla on a joyride to Kia without driving the car all that way. There's ways that we can bring technology to bear in such a manner that will unlock a lot of the opportunities that are out there and make all of your lives a lot easier to get through in a very productive way. So with that, I'm going to stop and see if there's any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Erik. I've got a couple questions maybe on this topic. So first and foremost, you talked about the forecast and how the forecast is still, it's still really important for what we're doing. And we absolutely need it to sort of predict the future and drive our future planning in some ways. Can you talk about how accurate do we need the forecast? How much time, effort, energy should we put into making the forecast perfect? Because I think that's the nature of our past MRP lives. We still need it, but what level of forecast accuracy or trend are we looking to achieve on that side?
Great question. I'm going to kind of take a little bit of a circular approach here, but
I was hoping you would.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. If I live in a world where the only way I can improve my supply chain is to get the forecast more accurate, I will stop at nothing to get that forecast as perfect as I can get it. I will find every idea I can because that's the only way I think I can get there. In reality, there is a Pareto curve to everything in life. And as we add more and more complexity into our forecasts, we don't gain incremental ground with each step and things start to get to where they plateau out, right? And so now we're out at that point where we're continuing to try to make the forecast better, but the results aren't getting any better. So you ask the question, how accurate does it need to be? Your forecast in truth only needs to be as accurate as what your operating model can support. So if I build in variability management through buffering with my stock positions, my production resources and the like, and I'm out there at the end of that tail still tweaking the forecast, I am clearly wasting my time. And so we absolutely believe at this intersection between push and pull kind of mindsets, that there is a way to give a people an idea that, hey, enough's enough, right? And maybe it's that we shift to probabilistic. One of the reasons why probabilistic forecasting hasn't really taken root is that MRP requires a deterministic signal, meaning one set of numbers. It doesn't know how to deal with two or three. And so probabilistic would give us kind of those boundaries, the high and low marks of and the levels of variation we need to deal with as a way of testing that operating model. If we've done that correctly, we'll have incredibly high service levels. We're not going to be carrying too much inventory, and we're going to be able to take our hands off the wheel. So I didn't give you a number, Brad,
Yeah.
but I think if you can understand that if my buffers can handle this much variation, anything I'm doing to try to get more perfect than that is a waste of time.
Right.
It truly is. Yep.
Yeah, and I love what you said. There's, it's a function. The accuracy that you need is a function of what your operating model can support. And so if people can adopt that and accept that, we can take a lot of pressure off ourselves in terms of what we're doing with the forecast. I mean, how much have we seen over the years? We talk to clients, we go on site, et cetera. These clients are judging themselves based on their forecast accuracy, but that's
Yep.
not really, it doesn't make any sense, right? Let's judge ourselves on the stuff that matters: our inventory, our service levels, our throughput, our manufacturing output, et cetera. And I
Yeah.
think if we can change the mindset of our industry in this way, and break the reliance on just getting the forecast more accurate, I think we'll have a lot more success.
Absolutely.
Erik, I love this chart, and you've been talking about this for, I don't know, long before we've known each other, probably for 30 years, about the unchanging inventory turns in the industry, even with the advent of all this technology along the way. And so I love this, and I've seen you talk about it for 10 years, and it certainly has stayed the same. So we've not really seen that uptick. Do you think now, I mean, we're on the precipice, or maybe in the midst of this huge AI revolution, and you talked about SpaceX and Tesla and so on and so forth. There's all this automation. Do you think over the next few years that your story about these inventory turns will break, and we'll actually see improvement at the macro level for our industry in terms of inventory?
That remains to be seen. None of the software manufacturers took their time to go re-examine the basic rules that they were providing with their ERP systems or supply chain management. They accepted that they were as good as it could get. They added a lot of whipped cream on top of that cake, trying to make it look better and snazzier and all that stuff. Anaplan came along, right? Oh my goodness, I can take this spreadsheet in the cloud and its industrial strength, and I can tailor it to meet my exact company needs. And well, okay, yes, you tailored it to meet your needs, but now you just have a best practices field of one. You only know what you know, and you've blinded yourself to innovations that can happen in the outside world, right? I think AI is an incredibly powerful tool, and Farhad will be talking about the steps we're doing. It is going to accelerate software development in a dramatic way. It is going to bring insight and capability, but we've got to aim it the right way, right? Some of the truths, it's not going to unravel the fact that people buy what they buy when they buy for whatever reasons they have. And unless you're going to wire a chip in every one of our brains, you're not going to know in advance what's going to happen. So you've got to accept that some of these realities are just what they are. It's like the serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to know what I can change and what I can't, right? And if instead we build flexibility into how we operate, we have reduced our work effort dramatically. And where AI can play a role in that, I think is profound. I think it can give users a much better understanding of the explainability. We've got an innovation coming out now for new product introductions, which not only generates the demand curve for the new offering, but also says why. And that, I think that human connection is the essential part of all of this, is explainability, giving people more trust in the system because they can relate to it now. Whereas today it's grids, numbers, all these charts, Power BI things. Okay, but you've got to sleuth your way through all of that to find what is really going on. And I think that part of explainability, helping users, trust the system more, is where the magic's going to come.